Okay, today we're going to be going over taxes and tax incident. So we're going to be discussing a special type of tax, and it's called the excise tax. An excise tax is a per unit tax. Usually on the sale of a good, the tax is added to the price of the good and paid at the point of sale, meaning that the buyer does not know what the tax is. All the buyer knows is the final price. An example here is gas, cigarettes, and alcohol. So if you go to the gas station and you buy gas, you know what the gallon price is, but you don't know how much tax is included there. That's an excise tax. So for a buyer, for you going to the gas station, the quantity that you demand depends on the price paid. So an increase in excise tax leads to an increase in price, which leads to a decrease in quantity demanded. So that means it's a change in price. So we're moving along the demand curve. The price that the buyer pays includes the tax. For a seller, the quantity supplied depends on the price the seller receives or keeps. So that's an important distinction. The seller collects the tax but doesn't get to keep it. So the price he receives is the sales price less the tax. The tax is added to the seller's price at every level of output. So the supply curve will shift left by the amount of the tax. And we'll be able to tell what the tax is by this vertical distance right here. So the vertical distance on the price axis, so the y-axis, the difference between this supply curve and this supply plus tax curve will tell us the amount of the tax. So the supply curve is shifting left, and this is going to give us what we call dead weight loss. Anytime the quantity that is exchanged is different than the quantity that would have been exchanged without a tax. So this is where we would have been without that tax, and this is where we are now. So the quantity is different. This triangular amount is going to be dead weight loss. So, for example, if we were to look at this supply and demand schedule without a tax, we would go down here and we would find equilibrium where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So at a price of $3, the quantity supplied is 3, the quantity demanded is 3, so that's equilibrium. The buyer pays $3, the seller receives $3, and everyone's happy. And at equilibrium, we can talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus. And what this is basically going to tell us is that total surplus is maximized at equilibrium without outside forces. Now we're going to assume that there's a $2 excise tax added. So at every price level, we're increasing it by $2. So this is the excise tax. So if the price was 0, now it's 3. If the price was 1, 1 plus 2 is 3. Actually, this is wrong. That should be 2. Anyway, we're going to go on down here. So remember, our equilibrium used to be 3. Now our equilibrium is 2. The quantity demanded and the quantity supplied has gone down because remember, that supply curve has shifted to the left. So here, the buyer pays $4, but the seller only gets 2 because the other $2 is the tax. So who gets the tax? The tax man, the government does. So at equilibrium, the consumer surplus is down, the producer surplus is down, and the total surplus is $4. So where's the other money? Dead weight loss. So we were here, 3 and 3. Then the amount of tax, you can see we were here at 0, now we're at 2. So this vertical difference tells us that the tax was $2. So our supply curve is shifting left by the amount of tax. Now we intersect here, $2, $4. So this is telling us that the buyer is paying $2 and they are demanding 2 units. But how much does the seller get? They only get $2. So this amount here, the difference between 2 and 4, is the amount of tax. But this amount here is deadweight loss. So this goes to the government. This is lost forever. So this is the inequity that results from having a tax introduced into the market. And who really pays that tax? Well, let's talk about the inefficiency. So a tax can lead to inefficiency when it leads to a decrease in the quantity exchanged such that the quantity exchanged is less than the amount for which marginal benefit equals marginal cost. So remember, the demand curve is also the marginal benefit curve, and the supply curve is also the marginal cost curve. So at the point where marginal cost equals marginal demand, the quantity exchange should be 3, but it isn't. It's 2. So that means that the quantity exchanged is less than the point at which marginal benefit equals marginal cost, resulting in deadweight loss. Okay? So there we go. So are we going to assume that this cost is going to be paid by the buyer? Or are we going to assume that the cost of the tax is going to be paid by the seller? Well, now we're going to have to go back to elasticity. Who actually pays the tax? Well, there is statutory incidence. That's who has the legal responsibility for the tax. So, for example, with gas, the statutory incidence lies with the store. The store collects the tax and sends it to the government. But economic incident tells us that the economic burden of a tax does not necessarily rest with the party that has the statutory incident. Sometimes the burden of the tax can be shifted, and who actually bears the burden depends on relative elasticities. So, two extremes. Perfectly inelastic demand, so remember it looks like the letter I, very inelastic, no good substitutes, so cigarettes or insulin. In this case, here's the original supply curve. So at a price of 8, quantity demanded is 50. But because there are no good substitutes, even though the supply curve has shifted, leading the price to go up to 10, you see that the quantity demanded has not changed. So in this case, because the buyer is sort of being held hostage, as it were, all of the tax will be passed to the buyer. Okay? Buyer bears the full burden of the tax because demand is perfectly inelastic. What if it's perfectly elastic? There's lots of good substitutes. In this case, demand is perfectly elastic if there is a price change of anything at all. The quantity demanded will be affected drastically. So in this case, the seller will bear the burden. All right, so bottled water, bulk agricultural products. In reality, it's very, very unusual, if not impossible, to find any good or service that is perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. So in reality, we can just say that the economic burden rests more heavily on the side of the market that is more inelastic. So if supply is more inelastic, meaning more vertical, then the seller will bear more of the tax burden. If demand is more inelastic, meaning that the demand curve is more vertical, then the buyer will bear more of that tax burden. All right. And you can see if both supply and demand are inelastic versus both being elastic, the market distortion or the inefficiency is the greatest when demand and supply are both elastic right here. All right. So I'm going to briefly go over this in the next session.